you've been lied to. History books tell you the Navy SEALs were the undisputed kings of the Vietnam War, the ultimate predators, the masters of the jungle, but they were wrong because deep in the green hell of the Mekong Delta, America's most feared warriors ran into something they couldn't explain, something quieter, something colder, something that made the legendary SEALs look like noisy amateurs. This isn't a story about a firefight. This is the classified account of what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable ghost. Imagine a Navy SEAL, a man built for violence, frozen in terror, not because of the enemy, but because the soldier standing next to him simply vanished into thin air. Who were the phantoms that taught the Americans that speed equals death? What is the Green Zone incident? A near-fatal mistake that the History Channel won't tell you about. And what was the terrifying lesson that forced the SEALs to completely rewrite their playbook? Buckle up. We are ripping open the archives to expose the clash of philosophies that the military tried to keep quiet. You think you know Special Forces? You have no idea. Watch until the very last second, because the secret we reveal at the end changed modern warfare forever. Let's go. To understand the absolute shock of this encounter, you have to rewind the tape and look into the beating heart of two completely different war machines. The United States Navy SEALs were forged in the fire and crashing waves of the Second World War, born from the underwater demolition teams who blew up beach defenses before invasions. And their genetic code was written in speed, aggression, and flexibility, and their playground became the Mekong Delta, a place where rivers served as high-speed highways and ambushes hid in the reeds. The SEALs struck hard, hit fast, and vanished, using velocity as a weapon, fear as a tool, and overwhelming force as the final punctuation mark on any engagement. Their doctrine was brutally simple and understood by every operator: neutralize the target fast, move even faster, and never stop moving. But try taking that frantic energy into the deep, silent thickets of the triple canopy jungle of South Vietnam, where visibility dropped to a few meters and every sudden movement echoed for kilometers. And this is where the Australian SAS stepped onto the stage, and unlike their American cousins, these men did not inherit their tactics from seaborne assaults. Their roots went back to the deadly long-range patrols in the scorching deserts of North Africa and the subsequent counterinsurgency warfare in the humid green hells of Malaya and Borneo. And these men did not crash through enemy territory like rhinos. They literally melted into it, becoming part of the foliage itself. They never opened fire unless it was absolutely unavoidable. And if they did pull the trigger, the fight was over before the enemy even realized what had happened. Their doctrine was not based on assault. It was built on total absence. Disappear, watch, record, and neutralize only if there is no other choice, then vanish into thin air again. For them, silence was not just a tactical trick. It was a sacred law of survival, ingrained through sweat and exhaustion. When these two elite forces found themselves on the same operations, sharing patrol zones and reconnaissance missions, the differences became immediately apparent and caused a genuine cultural shock. The SEALs moved in fire teams of 6 or 8 men, creating a heavy fist capable of punching through any defense. The SOAS patrols rarely exceeded 5 men, betting on stealth and mobility rather than raw firepower. The Americans were draped in weaponry like action movie heroes, carrying suppressed M16s, heavy M60 machine guns, and sometimes even shotguns for close-quarters chaos. The SAS operators preferred the proven L1A1 rifles or cut-down versions with the heavy stopping power of the 7.62 caliber, and often they would go a full week on patrol without firing a single shot. The difference in communication was even more striking and told you everything you needed to know about their mindsets. The SEALs actively used radios to coordinate, constantly chatting and announcing their presence on the airwaves. The SAS troopers often left their radios off entirely, communicating exclusively through hand signals or not communicating at all, moving as if connected by telepathy. One American team leader later described his first night with the Australians with unmasked amazement. He recounted how they set up a watch rotation, but the Australians simply lay down and froze for hours. When the American asked who was on sentry duty, the patrol commander signaled that they all were because they were not sleeping. They were listening to the jungle. This was their security system, and it was not arrogance. It was a deep philosophy of survival, honed over years. Where the SEALs saw an opportunity for initiative and attack, the SAS saw the risk of exposure and mission failure. But this was only the first shock in a long series of revelations that would shake the foundations of American confidence. Where the Americans bet on fluid and continuous momentum, the Australians demanded control through absolute, almost grave-like stillness. And in the real jungle, away from the reeds of the Delta, this stillness often won out, leaving American aggression far behind. But this was not a story about who was better. It was a story about two elite units, each masters of their craft, suddenly realizing a simple truth. They were fighting two completely different wars while standing in the exact same place. One war raced across the water and demanded speed. The other hid inside the trees and demanded patience. One relied on the lightning-fast execution of a sentence, the other on the perfect anticipation of the moment. Both were deadly in their trade, but their methods were like ice and fire. What followed this realization was not a conflict, but a quiet recognition, and the beginning of one of the most underrated tactical exchanges of the entire war, because both the SEALs and the SAS began to understand that each of them could do something the other simply could not. When the first joint patrols between the Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS were finally approved by High Command, both sides expected mutual professionalism. They were the elite, they were disciplined, and they respected each other's reputation. But no one, absolutely no one, expected the deafening silence that swallowed them whole. For the SEALs, the operation began like any other. The insertion went smoothly. Comms were clear, and weapons were loaded and checked. But the moment they pushed less than 200 meters into the jungle, everything started to feel wrong. It was not a sense of danger or hostility. It was just a feeling that everything was off. The Australians were behaving strangely. They did not speak. They did not point fingers. They did not look around with urgency. They simply moved slowly and deliberately, as if they had walked this exact trail 100 times before. No chatter, no small talk, no clicks on the radio, just an eerie, unnatural stillness of sound. Even their gear was mute. No clinking metal, no rustling backpacks. Everything was taped up, padded with soft cloth and dulled to the limit. Then came the first real test of nerves. A faint rustle, perhaps enemy movement, sounded just ahead. The SEAL point man instinctively froze and signaled the rest of the team. But when he turned around to check on the Australians, they were no longer visible. They were already on the ground, flat, silent, vanished. No whisper, no sound of footsteps, not a single breath. One of them had dissolved behind a cluster of roots so effectively that even the American walking right next to him had to squint to find him. The patrol halted. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. The jungle buzzed, mosquitoes bit, sweat pooled in their eyes, but the SAS men did not move a single millimeter. They watched, listened, and waited. After nearly an hour of absolute silence, the SEAL team leader whispered a question, asking if they saw anything. The Australian patrol commander did not turn his head, did not blink. He simply whispered back that if the enemy had not seen them yet, they would not see them at all, so they should leave it be. It was not just the silence that caught the Americans off guard. It was the iron discipline within that silence. They were not being told to wait. They were being taught to disappear. The SEALs were used to tight formations, constant comms checks, and an aggressive tempo. The SAS moved more like shadows, detached from one another, linked only by instinct and trust. No radios, no markers, just an internal rhythm honed by months and years of crawling through the bush in near total silence. By the end of that day, the Americans began to notice the subtle art hidden behind the Australian method. They saw how they timed their movements with gusts of wind, how they froze when the birds stopped singing, how they angled their bodies to blend with the broken lines of trees or termite mounds. Nothing was random, and the most unsettling part was that they made it look easy. One of the SEALs later recalled that they did not move fast, but they never stopped moving. It was like trying to keep up with fog. That first patrol did not end in a firefight. There was no contact, No spilled blood, just pure observation, a smooth withdrawal, and enough intelligence gathered to plan a larger strike later. But something shifted in their minds during that patrol. The SEALs entered the jungle as equals, but they left it as students. But the true depth of the Australian obsession with invisibility revealed itself not in the deep bush, but at the edge of the water, where the rules of survival were written in wet clay and blood. During a routine insertion into a hostile sector, a combined patrol reached the banks of a muddy, slow-moving stream that cut through the jungle like a brown scar. For the Navy SEALs, who were born in the surf and raised on amphibious assaults, this was their home turf, and their instinct was to cross quickly, hit the opposite bank hard, and push inland before the enemy could react. They prepared to surge out of the water and scramble up the dry, clay-heavy embankment to secure a perimeter. But before a single American boot could touch dry land, the Australian point man signaled a hard stop. He did not point to the bank. He pointed upstream into the thick, choking vegetation that overhung the river. The order was baffling and seemingly insane. They were not going to exit the river here. They were going to wade 300 meters upstream, submerged up to their necks, fighting the current and the underwater roots. The Americans were furious inside, their muscles twitching with the urge to move, but they followed the lead of the ghosts because they had agreed to play by Australian rules. For 45 agonizing minutes, the team dragged themselves through the murky water, slipping on slime-covered rocks and fighting off the panic of leeches latching onto their skin. They moved like driftwood, barely breaking the surface, while their eyes scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. Finally, 300 meters away from their original crossing point, the Australian commander signaled to exit on a rocky outcrop where their wet boots would leave no imprint. They shook off the water and melted into the ferns, shivering and frustrated by what felt like a waste of precious time and energy. But that frustration lasted exactly 55 minutes. From their concealed position, they watched the spot on the riverbank where the SEALs had originally wanted to climb out. A patrol of Viet Cong trackers emerged from the trees, leading 2 lean, aggressive dogs on long leashes. The animals went straight to the water's edge, sniffing the clay, searching for the scent of wet fabric or the disturbance of a boot heel. If the team had climbed out there, the wet prints on the dry clay would have been a neon sign pointing directly to their location, and the dogs would have been on them within minutes. The SEALs watched in cold silence as the enemy trackers argued, found nothing, and eventually moved on. The realization hit the Americans like a physical blow. What they had dismissed as paranoia was actually a life-saving calculation. The Australians understood that in this war, a single wet footprint was a death sentence, and laziness was the fastest way to a shallow grave. This incident was the turning point that transformed the relationship from professional courtesy to an intense masterclass in survival. The Navy SEALs, who were already the most lethal maritime commando force on the planet, began to strip away their own ego to absorb the almost monastic habits of the Australian SAS. The first and hardest lesson was the art of movement, which required a complete rewiring of their nervous systems. And the SEALs were athletes, trained to explode with violence and speed, but the SAS operated on a timeline that felt geologic by comparison. Where an American unit might push to cover a kilometer in an hour to reach an objective, the Australians would sometimes take a full hour to navigate just 10 meters of dense terrain. At first, the SEALs found this maddening, a torture of slow motion that felt too cautious and too passive for their aggressive blood. But as they watched the Australians glide over dry leaf litter without cracking a single twig, the frustration turned into professional fascination. The SAS operators taught them to place the outside edge of the boot first, rolling the weight inward to feel for dry sticks before committing to the step. They taught them to move their bodies through the brush like water, turning sideways to slip between vines rather than pushing them aside, because a swaying bush is a beacon to a watching enemy. The Americans learned to read the jungle before they even touched it, spotting the broken patterns in the foliage, the shadows that were too straight to be natural, and the leaves that were bent in a direction that defied the wind. They learned to look not for the enemy, but for the absence of the normal jungle rhythm. The second lesson was the terrifying discipline of absolute stillness. One moonless night, the joint patrol settled into an ambush position overlooking a suspected supply trail, used by the North Vietnamese Army. The SAS did not set up a rotation of sentries. They simply lay down in their firing positions and became statues carved from the darkness. Minutes dragged into hours, and the jungle insects began to feast on their exposed skin. But no one slapped a mosquito. No one shifted their weight to relieve a cramping leg, and no one reached for a canteen. The SEALs held their breath, forcing their bodies to mimic the frozen state of their allies, waiting for a signal that never came. Just as the gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, the reward for their suffering materialized. A column of enemy soldiers walked right into the kill zone, completely unaware that 10 heavily armed men were lying less than 15 meters away. When the ambush was sprung, it was over in seconds, a perfect mechanical execution born from the patience of a stone. Another critical lesson was the obsessive management of their signature, the sensory footprint they left on the world. The SAS were fanatical about eliminating anything that could betray them. They wrapped every metal buckle and clip in green tape to prevent even the slightest metallic click. For they stripped all brand labels and reflective paint from their gear, rubbing mud into zippers and buttons until everything was a dull, uniform matte. They stopped using soap and shaving cream weeks before patrol to let their natural scent mask the chemical smell of hygiene products, and they ate only cold food to avoid the smell of cooking fuel. The SEALs, who were tinkerers by nature, took these lessons and applied them with their own engineering mindset, modifying their kits to be as silent as the Australians. Finally, the most surprising lesson was the discipline of restraint, the ability to not pull the trigger even when the target was in plain sight. During a long-range reconnaissance patrol, the combined team spotted 3 Viet Cong scouts walking down a narrow trail, weapons slung over their shoulders, completely relaxed. The SEAL point man raised his suppressed rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger for a quick, clean neutralization of the threat. But before he could fire, an SAS corporal gently placed a hand on his barrel and pushed it down, shaking his head slowly. He whispered barely audibly that they needed the rest of the column, not just the eyes. So they waited. They lay in the mud for 30 minutes, then 40, watching the empty trail. Finally, the main force arrived, over 100 soldiers carrying heavy crates of ammunition and medical supplies. The SEAL lowered his weapon, sweating from the realization of what he had almost done. If he had engaged the 3 scouts, the 100 men behind them would have scattered and hunted the patrol down. Later, he admitted to his team that the Australians did not just look at the battlefield, they looked at the logic behind it. By the end of that deployment, the SEALs had absorbed invaluable lessons on how to slow down, how to vanish, and how to gather intelligence without announcing their presence, realizing that sometimes the most aggressive move you can make is to do absolutely nothing at all. But the most terrifying lesson of the war did not happen in a classroom or during a briefing. It happened in the suffocating blackness of a moonless night deep in what the maps called the Green Zone. This was an area so infested with enemy forces that entering it was considered a guaranteed one-way ticket for any conventional unit, and even special operators trod lightly there. A combined patrol of Navy SEALs and Australian SAS had inserted by helicopter at dusk, intending to set up an observation post on a ridge overlooking a key valley. However, the thick triple canopy jungle played tricks on their compasses, and the heavy monsoon rain masked the terrain features, leading to a navigational error of less than 300 meters. In any other war, 300 meters is a rounding error. In Vietnam, it was the difference between life and a tragedy. As the team crept forward through the undergrowth, moving with the agonizing slowness they had practiced, the point man suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his hand signaling a freeze so rigid it looked like rigor mortis. The team leader crept forward, expecting to see a tripwire or a sentry, but what he saw made his blood turn to ice in his veins. They were not approaching an enemy camp. They were already inside it. Through the gloom and the driving rain, they could make out the shapes of hammocks strung between the trees, dozens of them stretching out into the darkness on all sides. They were standing in the middle of a sleeping Viet Cong battalion base, surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers who were resting just arm's length away. The smell of unwashed bodies, damp canvas, and the pungent aroma of fish sauce hung heavy in the humid air, sickeningly close. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were outnumbered 50 to 1, completely surrounded, and one wrong step, one cough, or one metallic click would mean instant annihilation. The American instinct, honed by years of aggressive doctrine and the philosophy of overwhelming violence of action, kicked in immediately. The SEAL machine gunner began to raise his heavy M60, his thumb moving toward the safety catch, his mind already calculating the angles of fire. His training screamed at him to open up, to unleash a wall of lead, to create chaos and cut a path to freedom through sheer firepower. It was the SEAL way. If you are trapped, you attack with everything you have. But before his finger could curl around the trigger, a hand clamped onto his wrist with a grip like iron. It was the Australian patrol commander. He did not speak. He did not even look at the American. He simply stared into the darkness and shook his head with a slow, deliberate movement that allowed no argument. With his other hand, he made a gesture that was foreign to the SEAL manuals, but instantly understood in the universal language of survival. Backward, step for step, breathe for breathe. What followed was the longest, most terrifying 4 hours of their lives, a silent horror movie where the monsters were sleeping inches away. The Australian commander led the way, reversing their path with a level of control that seemed supernatural. He did not just walk backward, he placed his boots back into the exact indentations they had made on the way in, ensuring that no new mud was disturbed. The team moved as a single organism, stepping over the sleeping forms of enemy soldiers who were curled up in ponchos on the wet ground. At one point, a SEAL operator had to pause with one foot in the air for 5 full minutes because a Viet Cong soldier rolled over in his sleep, muttering something in a dream, his hand brushing against the American's boot. The SEAL bit his lip until he tasted copper, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but he did not move. He did not breathe. He simply became a statue in the rain. The tension was so thick it felt like it could crush their lungs. Every drop of rain that hit a leaf sounded like a gunshot to their heightened senses. Every breath they took had to be shallow and silent, filtered through clenched teeth. The Australians monitored the breathing of the Americans, tapping them on the shoulder to regulate their rhythm, forcing them to slow down their heart rates through sheer force of will. It took them 4 agonizing hours to cover the 200 meters back to the edge of the perimeter. When they finally slipped into the safety of the deep jungle, leaving the sleeping camp undisturbed, the SEALs collapsed against the trees, shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the massive adrenaline crash. One of the hardened American veterans later admitted that he had been in dozens of firefights, had stormed beaches and cleared bunkers, but that silent walk through the sleeping enemy camp was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced. The Australian refusal to fire, that absolute discipline to choose life over glory, had saved them all from a massacre. But this exchange of wisdom was not a one-way street, and anyone who claims the Australians were the only teachers in this relationship is ignoring the cold, hard facts of war. While the SEALs were learning the art of invisibility, the SAS troopers were quietly observing the American machine and realizing that their own methods, while elegant, were sometimes too slow and too conservative for this brutal new conflict. The Australians were pragmatists to the bone, and they saw that the SEALs possessed a technological and tactical aggression that could be devastatingly effective. The first thing that caught the envy of the Australian operators was the American weaponry. The SAS were still carrying the heavy, long-barreled L1A1 battle rifles, weapons designed for the open plains of Europe, not the cramped confines of a bamboo forest. They watched with jealousy as the SEALs wielded the CAR-15, a short, telescoping stock version of the M16 that was light, rapid-firing, and perfect for close-quarters jungle fighting. It was a weapon from the future, compact enough to swing around in a tight tunnel, yet lethal enough to put a target down instantly. The SAS also marveled at the American grenade launchers, the M79 and the underbarrel M203, which gave a small 4-man patrol the explosive punch of an artillery unit. The Australians realized that in a contact where they were outnumbered, volume of fire mattered just as much as precision. Slowly, quietly, the SAS armories began to change. Australian troopers started acquiring American weapons through unofficial channels, trading cases of beer or captured souvenirs for the sleek black rifles and grenade launchers that gave them a fighting chance when the stealth failed. But it was not just the guns, it was the mindset of mobility and the use of air power that fascinated the Australians. The SAS tradition was to walk in and walk out, carrying 80-pound packs for weeks, enduring a slow, grinding exhaustion. The SEALs, however, treated helicopters like taxis. They had perfected the art of the hot extraction, developing a doctrine where they could hit a target hard and be pulled out of the jungle by a Huey gunship within minutes, regardless of the terrain. The Australians saw the value in this slam and jam approach. They realized that sometimes staying in the jungle for weeks was not a badge of honor, but an unnecessary risk. They began to adopt the SEALs' aggressive extraction techniques, learning to coordinate with gunship pilots to lay down suppressive fire while winching men out of the canopy. This was a radical shift from their ghost philosophy, a recognition that sometimes speed is the best armor. Furthermore, the Australians developed a begrudging respect for the sheer engineering ingenuity of the SEALs. The SAS tended to use their gear exactly as it was issued, making do with what the Queen provided. The SEALs, on the other hand, were warrior engineers who could not stop tinkering. If a piece of equipment did not work, they cut it, taped it, painted it, or rebuilt it until it did. The Australians watched as SEALs sawed off the barrels of shotguns to create devastating, widespread weapons for point men. They saw how Americans rigged strobe lights to their compasses for signaling aircraft and how they waterproofed their radios with condoms and tape. This culture of modification was infectious. Soon, SAS troopers were seen sewing custom pockets onto their uniforms, modifying their webbing to carry more ammunition, and painting their faces with the aggressive green and black tiger stripe patterns favored by their American cousins. The exchange went even deeper into the realm of waterborne operations. The SAS were masters of the land, but the SEALs were the undisputed kings of the water. In the flooded mangrove swamps and the endless waterways of the Delta, the Australians felt out of their element, moving clumsily and slowly. The SEALs showed them how to use the water as a highway rather than an obstacle. They taught the SAS how to swim silently with full gear, how to waterproof their weapons for immediate firing upon surfacing, and how to use small, inflatable boats to insert deep behind enemy lines without leaving a single footprint. This opened up a whole new dimension of warfare for the Australians, allowing them to strike at targets that had previously been considered unreachable. They realized that the SEALs' aggression was not recklessness, it was a calculated confidence born from superior technology and a refusal to be limited by the environment. By the middle of 1969, the transformation was visible to anyone who knew where to look. You could see SAS patrols carrying American carbines and calling in airstrikes with the confidence of Texans, and you could see Navy SEAL teams moving through the bush with the slow, deliberate rolling gait of an Australian tracker. The lines between the two units began to blur. The Americans became quieter, more patient, more lethal in their silence. The Australians became faster, harder hitting, and more technologically advanced. It was no longer a clash of philosophies. It was a fusion of the best traits of the world's two most dangerous warrior cultures. They had stopped trying to prove who was better and had started focusing on the only thing that mattered, keeping each other alive in a war that wanted them all gone. This mutual evolution was never officially codified in any manual. It was written in the nod of a head between patrol leaders, in the exchange of a battered magazine, and in the shared canteen of water after a firefight. The SEALs learned that patience is a form of aggression, that waiting 3 days for a single shot is sometimes more devastating than 1,000 rounds fired in panic. The SAS learned that technology and overwhelming firepower, when applied with precision, can turn the tide of a hopeless battle. In the crucible of Vietnam, under the crushing weight of the monsoon rain and the constant threat of the enemy, these two elite forces forged something rare and unbreakable. It was a respect without words, a brotherhood that did not need to be spoken. They were the steel and the shadow, the hammer and the ghost, and together they became something far more terrifying than they ever could have been alone. But before the final descent into the hell of the jungle, there was a moment of quiet that cemented this alliance more than any firefight ever could. It happened on the perimeter of the Nui Dat base under the heavy purple sky of a Vietnamese twilight, where the air was thick enough to chew and smelled of burning diesel and damp earth. The joint team had returned from a grueling reconnaissance workup and was preparing for what intelligence promised would be the most dangerous mission of their tour. The barriers of rank and nationality, usually so rigid in the military, had completely dissolved in the humidity. The Americans, known for their logistical abundance, broke open crates of their sought-after long-range patrol rations, sharing the freeze-dried delicacies that were a luxury compared to the standard-issue sludge. In return, the Australians introduced the SEALs to the sacred ritual of the brew, teaching them how to boil water for tea in a blackened tin can over a smokeless hexamine tablet, a trick that allowed for a hot drink deep in enemy territory without giving away a position. It was in this flickering light of the hexamine stoves that the true nature of their bond was revealed, not through grand speeches but through the exchange of steel and cloth. A hardened Navy SEAL, a man who had survived the freezing mud of training and the worst ambushes of the Delta, pulled a heavy, leather-handled K-bar knife from his belt. This was not just a tool, it was a piece of American mythology, a blade that had been sharpened 1,000 times and carried through every patrol. Without a word of ceremony, he handed it to the Australian patrol commander, a gesture that in warrior culture meant more than giving away a pile of gold. It was a transfer of luck, a sharing of lethality. The Australian, a man of few words who usually expressed himself with a raised eyebrow, accepted the blade and slowly removed his own hat. It was the iconic bush hat, the giggle hat, with its brim cut short to prevent tunnel vision, and the fabric stained dark with the sweat of 100 patrols. He handed it to the American, completing a silent pact. They were no longer just allies fighting a common enemy. They were brothers bound by the shared knowledge that tomorrow one of them might not come back. But this moment of fraternity was merely the deep breath before the plunge into the abyss. The intelligence reports were solid, terrifyingly so. A massive North Vietnamese logistical column was moving through the dense, rain-soaked hills of Phuoc Tuy province, carrying enough munitions to fuel a month of offensives. The mission was not just to observe, it was to shatter this spine of supply. The joint team inserted by helicopter into a landing zone so tight the rotor blades clipped the tree branches and immediately the jungle swallowed them whole. The monsoon season had turned the world into a gray, weeping purgatory. The rain did not fall. It hammered, a relentless vertical ocean that turned the ground into a soup of mud and rotting vegetation. For 48 hours, the combined force moved into position, and for 48 hours, the rain never stopped. They set up a classic L-shaped ambush along a muddy rise overlooking the trail, a position that would allow them to catch the enemy in a devastating crossfire. And then, the waiting began. This was the ultimate test of the fusion between SEAL aggression and SAS patience. The Americans, their nerves wired tight by the adrenaline of the impending clash, had to force their bodies to shut down. They lay in the mud, half buried in wet leaves, allowing leeches to latch onto their skin without flinching, ignoring the cramps that twisted their muscles. The Australians were already gone, mentally and physically, having entered that trance-like state of hibernation they were famous for. They became stumps, they became roots, they became nothing. The first test of their discipline came on the morning of the third day. A rustle on the trail, faint but distinct over the sound of the rain. A group of 4 Viet Cong scouts emerged from the mist, moving with the wary, jerky movements of men who know they are hunted. They were the bait, the eyes of the dragon. The American machine gunner felt his heart slam against his ribs, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger of his M60. Every instinct in his body screamed to open fire, to obliterate the targets in front of him. It would have been an easy victory, 4 confirmed neutralizations in 2 seconds, but the ghost of the Australian training whispered in his ear. He remembered the lesson, do not take the pawn if you want the king. He froze, his breath held in his burning lungs, and watched as the scouts walked past his barrel so close he could see the mud on their sandals. The patrol let them pass, a gamble that defied every survival instinct, trusting that the main prize was still to come. An hour passed, then 2. The silence of the jungle returned, heavy and oppressive. Had they missed their chance? Had the intelligence been wrong? Doubt began to creep into the minds of the SEALs, a cold worm of anxiety, but the Australian commander did not move a muscle. He knew. And then the ground began to vibrate. It was a sound felt before it was heard, the rhythmic thud of hundreds of feet slogging through mud. The main column appeared like a dark snake winding through the trees. It was massive, dozens of soldiers heavily armed, carrying crates of rockets and mortars, confident that their scouts had cleared the way. They walked with their weapons slung, talking in low voices, convinced of their safety. The SEAL team leader waited until the center of the column was directly in front of the Claymore mines. He looked at the Australian commander, who gave a single, imperceptible nod. The Americans squeezed the clacker. The jungle disintegrated. The explosion of the directional mines was not a sound. It was a physical punch that flattened the vegetation and shattered the air. Before the echoes could even bounce off the trees, the combined team opened fire. It was 7 seconds of orchestrated apocalypse. The heavy rattle of the M60 machine guns mixed with the sharp cracks of the SAS rifles and the thumping cough of the grenade launchers. It was not a chaotic spray of bullets. It was a surgical removal of the enemy force. Tracers zipped through the mist like angry hornets, cutting down the column in a scythe of lead. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firing stopped. The command, "Cease fire," was not shouted. It was signaled. The silence that rushed back into the void was more deafening than the noise. Smoke hung low over the trail, mixing with the metallic smell of cordite and the copper scent of the aftermath. The column had been severed, broken and neutralized in less time than it takes to draw a deep breath. But it was in the immediate aftermath that the cultural difference, now tempered by mutual respect, flared up one last time. The Americans were vibrating with the massive dump of adrenaline, their eyes wide, checking their weapons with frantic energy, grinning with the rush of survival. They were electric, alive with the high of the combat. The Australians, in stark contrast, simply stood up slowly, their faces masks of bored indifference. They began to methodically pick up their empty brass casings, checking their boots for leeches and rearranging their webbing as if they had just finished a routine training exercise on a Sunday afternoon. One SEAL looked at his Australian counterpart, shaking his head in disbelief at the icy calmness, and asked if his pulse ever went above resting rate. The Australian trooper didn't smile. He just wiped the mud from his rifle and replied that panic is a waste of good energy. They moved out toward the extraction zone, the Americans buzzing like high-tension wires, the Australians gliding like ghosts, 2 different speeds moving in the same direction, leaving the jungle to bury its secrets. In Vietnam, respect was not earned through rank, medals, or the number of firefights survived. It was earned in the mud, under the suffocating canopy, and in the silent, agonizing space between one breath and the next. For the Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS, it was not friendship that formed in those joint missions. It was something far deeper, something that echoed with the primal recognition of a warrior for his equal. After that final devastating ambush, the SEALs were buzzing with questions, desperate to understand how the Australians had known it was only the forward scouts, how they had timed the attack so perfectly, and how they had moved so silently while soaked, exhausted, and fully armed. The Australians, true to their nature, did not brag or offer lengthy explanations. They simply cleaned their rifles in stoic silence, checked their boots for leeches, and repacked their gear with methodical precision. But in that very silence, the Americans finally began to see the truth. This was not just a skill set, it was a mindset. These men did not just know the jungle, they had surrendered to it, allowing its rhythms to shape their tempo, their instincts, and their very judgment. One American SEAL officer quietly admitted later that he thought they were the best, but those guys, they were not even playing the same game. He said they were loud and fast, while the Australians were slow and final. But the profound respect flowed both ways with the power of a monsoon river. The SAS saw in the SEALs a kind of controlled surgical aggression they did not often allow themselves. When the time came to strike, the Americans moved like lightning, their communication sharp, their fire discipline tight, and their ability to break contact under extreme pressure was nothing short of impressive. In the secret debriefs after missions, SAS troopers often noted that the Americans were louder than them, but they were never sloppy and that distinction mattered because in jungle warfare, noise was sometimes necessary, but only when every bullet had a reason. By the middle of 1969, the Quiet Revolution was well underway. SEALs operating in the Delta and along the coast began requesting cross-training opportunities with SAS patrols stationed inland, not for joint operations, but specifically to learn to understand bush movement, long-term camouflage, jungle hygiene, and the sacred art of how to disappear. In turn, SS teams began experimenting with lighter American gear, trying out modified webbing setups, and incorporating elements of SEAL short-duration strike tactics for specific missions, especially when speed mattered more than invisibility. They were not trying to become each other. They were refining their own deadly edge, and while neither unit ever openly admitted it, they began tracking each other's lessons learned, quietly absorbing the new wisdom. SEALs started packing lighter, and SS troopers began carrying smaller American radios. Even their slang bled across the cultural divide. The Aussies started calling some fast recon insertions SEAL drops, while the Americans began referring to long-duration passive reconnaissance as ghosting, a clear nod to the Australian way. They never called it a rivalry. It was evolution, pure and simple. One SEAL said it best after a joint mission, stating that they did not come back trying to be them. They came back more aware of what they were not and what they could become. In the crucible of Vietnam, under the crushing weight of rain, fear, and discipline, two elite forces forged something incredibly rare: respect without words, lessons without lectures, and a brotherhood without ever needing to say the word. When the war finally wound down, both the Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS packed up their gear, cleaned their weapons one last time, and disappeared from the Vietnamese jungle. The trees closed in behind them, and the trails they once patrolled were swallowed by the relentless foliage. But something remained. Something that did not rust or rot lingered in the humid air. A legacy. For the SEALs, Vietnam was the forge that shaped them into the legendary force they are today. It was in those jungles, river deltas, and hostile villages that they learned how to blend raw aggression with surgical restraint, overwhelming firepower with whispered finesse. But they did not learn it all alone. The missions with the SS left an indelible mark, not in official tactics manuals or doctrinal papers, but in the small things: how to move slower, how to listen deeper, and how to wait when every fiber of your being is screaming to act. Veterans who walked beside the Australian SAS teams came back with a sharpened, colder edge. They passed it on, not as orders, but as whispered advice to new operators. If you want to learn patience, follow an Aussie through the trees. For the SAS, the SEALs were a brutal, exhilarating glimpse into what was possible when speed, firepower, and American boldness were weaponized correctly. The Australians never tried to copy the American swagger, but they respected their relentless forward push and their refusal to be intimidated, and they took pieces of it with them. They did not have to, but they did, because in their world, every single edge counts. Some of those SEALs would go on to command future generations of operators in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of those SAS troopers would later train the next wave of ghost walkers for other conflicts in places like East Timor and beyond. The lessons from Vietnam, carved into their muscle memory by monsoon rain and the constant threat of ambush, never left them. Years later, at joint training exercises in the searing heat of the Australian outback or the dusty deserts of California, operators from both nations would find themselves on the same range, on the same trail, on the same team. They would nod once, no words needed, because the bond made in Vietnam was not forged in campfire stories or pinned on a uniform. It was made in the shared, suffocating silence before an ambush, and in the look across the jungle floor when both sides realized they fought differently, but they fought for the exact same outcome: victory without waste, precision without pride, and violence only when it meant survival. Today, when historians speak of the elite units in Vietnam, they talk about the Navy SEALs with their riverine raids and high-value targets, and they talk about the SAS patrols tracking the enemy for weeks and vanishing without a trace, but they rarely mention the quiet, humid, and deadly space where those two worlds overlapped. Yet it was in that space that a brotherhood was born, not of nation but of mindset. And that brotherhood still whispers through the ranks today. Every time a special operator holds his breath, waits longer than feels comfortable, and strikes only when the time is absolutely perfect, just like the Phantoms once did, and just like the SEALs learned to do in a jungle that never gave second chances.